Hello, this is Mrs. V, and here is your lecture we're going to do on characteristics of life. So you should already have open from your Google Classroom. You should already have your Cornell Notes template open that I have attached to that Google Classroom assignment so that you can begin taking notes. The essential question for this one that you're going to write down onto your notes are, what are the characteristics of life? Now please remember, the only thing I would accept with your notes would be in that Cornell Notes template. That is what you can only submit for your notes. So please use it. Please get on the classroom, onto coursework, find the notes and open up that document so you can turn it in when you are all done. Okay. So, characteristics of life, what does it mean? It is rules that we can use so that we can determine if something is alive or not, such as here's some beans, okay, and a monkey, and maybe this. So we would use these different guidelines to determine if something is alive. And you will use these in a lab tomorrow, okay? So, are all of these pictures of living things? So that would be a yes or no. What do you think? Is it all living? So there's 8 characteristics or 8 basic principles that we use. The first one is living things are made of cells. So if you think about a rock, that is a non-living thing. It is not made of cells. So all living things are made of cells. And you notice I haven't highlighted anything, but all this stuff is important. So make sure you're writing all this down. You should be writing these in the notes or typing them out. Second one is living things reproduce. So they make other living things. The third thing is living things have a genetic code, which is DNA, which we'll talk about in a little bit. We're going to go through in detail a little bit more about each one of these. Number 4 is living things grow and develop. 5th one is living things use and need energy. 6th thing is living things respond to stimuli, and we'll define stimuli and learn a little bit more about that. And living things maintain homeostasis. We'll define homeostasis in our vocabulary, learn more about that. And living things adapt and evolve. So if you're watching this on video, pause it. Make sure all of these are typed into your notes. These are all very, very important. Okay? So now we're going to go over a little more in detail. So number 1, living things are made of cells. So what does that mean? Cells are the basic unit of life. So everything that is alive, that is one of the smallest things. Of course, we'll get down into DNA, which is even more smaller, but cells are basically the basic unit of life. A unicellular is made of one cell. U-N-I, is Greek, and it means one, and then cellular, so one cell. Multicellular, made of many cells, so M-U-L-T-I. I will go through these prefixes and stuff with you a lot. Multi means many, okay, so multiple. So multicellular means made of many cells, okay. So let's look at unicellular organisms. The first thing is you can have bacteria. So this amoeba here, this is a unicellular being. Living thing. You can tell it's just one cell and it has everything in there, and we'll talk more about them as we get deeper into cells too. This is a paramecium. It's another type of bacteria. They are unicellular organisms. They are made of one cell. Okay, how about living things produce is our second criteria. So what does that mean? Living things produce offspring that resemble the parents. Not that they look completely different from the parents, they actually resemble the parents, just like all of us. Reproduction can occur in 2 ways. So there's 2 ways to have reproduction. You have asexual, which means there's one parent, which actually happens a lot in bacteria, is that it is one and it splits into 2. Clone, you guys all might have heard of Dolly the sheep. Clone, that was one parent. Basically, they just took the cells of one sheep and they made a new one. And sexual has 2 parents, and that example is sperm and egg. So asexual has 1 parent and sexual has 2 parents. Okay. What asexual versus versus sexual reproduction. Let's look at the difference. So you've got here, this here is asexual, so this is a bacteria, and you can see it's just plainly split in two, and then you have two. You will get no more than two. In sexual reproduction, such as in these little cute little puppies down here, you get more than one. So in sexual reproduction, you get more than one, but in asexual, you will only go from 1 to 2. Okay. Living things have a genetic code. So this is a picture of DNA here. Inherited traits, that's traits or things that you see, are carried in the DNA. So you may have one of your parents' colored eyes. You may have their hair color. You may have their nose. Those are all inherited traits, and those are all carried in the DNA that's inside our cells. All cells of living things contain DNA. So everything that is living has DNA. Unicellular or multicellular, they all have DNA. Okay. Living things grow and develop. So living things do not just stay the size they are. Just like you are not the size you were when you were born. You are not the size you were when you were conceived. A plant does not stay the same size. Living things will grow and develop. So they grow, which means increase in size and shape, and develop, they will mature over time, just like you are maturing over time every day. And they have a lifespan. So everything that is living does not live forever. A rock can live for millions of years. We cannot, because we are living. The rock is not living, but they have a lifespan and they live and die. Living things use and need energy. So just like you need and use energy. All organisms require energy and raw materials for food. Raw materials, which is food. So if you don't eat, you don't live. Same for every living thing that's out there. Same for bacteria. Same for unicellular and multicellular. Metabolism is the total sum of all chemical reactions in the body needed for life. So those are all the things, and we'll talk more about this in the next unit. But metabolism, how you break down your food into smaller, what we call elements for your body to use. What is food for plants? Or what is food for bacteria? What do they have? What would we think we would need? Of course, for plants, you would think, oh, well, that would be the soil and the sun and the water. And bacteria, what would they need? Depends on the bacteria. Organisms need energy. So anything alive needs energy. They cannot not have energy. Of course, remember when we talked about that living things reproduce? Well, they need energy for reproduction. I said living things grow and develop. Well, they need energy for that. And response to a stimuli, we'll talk about that in a minute, but you need energy for that as well. And we'll talk about how they use energy to maintain homeostasis as well. So number 6, living things respond to stimuli. Okay, so you have a picture here, the stimulus, the hot stove. The response is to say ouch and take your hand away. So a stimuli is an event that causes a response in an organ or tissue. So it's something that's there. One of the great examples is number 1, burning your hand. Another great example would be sweating. Okay, the stimuli is that the sun is there making you hot, and so your body sweats. Okay, and that's the response of your skin as your skin gets hot. And the reaction is response to a stimuli. So this is not a mental stimuli and response, it is a physical one. Okay. So examples like we just gave, the hot hand on the stove, you could say sweating is a stimuli. Well, it's a response to a stimuli. The stimuli is that your skin gets hot, and so you go ahead and sweat. Okay, so you can think of some other examples as you're processing your notes today. Number 7 is living things maintain homeostasis, so things stay just perfectly. So homeostasis is an internal balance, so it's everything on the inside. Just like the example I just gave with sweating, okay, is that your body wants to stay at a certain temperature, and so it begins sweating and letting the water out in the pores to cool off the skin to keep it at a certain temperature. So we want to keep it at a certain temperature. Examples, like I just said, is sweating. You would say the burning of the hand is that you wouldn't leave your hand on the hot stove because it would get too hot. So that's why it's pulled off. Your body responds to that. And we're going to talk more about a lot of these with homeostasis in your body, about some loops, feedback loops, positive and negative, in the next unit. We'll get even more into detail about this. One example we'll use next unit would be blood sugar. Okay. And then you can also put in your notes as you're processing, what else can you think? What else does your body do to do that? I can think of flight or fight. So it's when you get scared, and what does your body do? Okay. Living things adapt and evolve. So living things never stay the same. So you can see the giraffe here. Started off with a short neck, but as the trees got taller and taller, those necks stretched out. So they adapt and evolve over generations. Adapt to a long-range changes in the environment. So adapt means that it takes generations after generations after generations in response to the change in the environment. Like this giraffe growing its neck. There's a turtle on the Galapagos Islands that actually has the little hump in their shell just above their head, got deeper and deeper because the plants got growing taller and taller so that they could stretch their neck a little bit. That's adapt. These changes result in better survival. So when they adapt, that means they're better surviving, which means they don't die. They get food, they get energy, they're able to reproduce. That is what we talk about, survival. And evolution adaptation take place over a long, long period of time. It's not from one to the next. We're talking years that this happens to adapt and evolve. Okay? And it involves the entire species. It's not just one giraffe. It's all the giraffes, because the ones that actually grow their necks and adapt and evolve are the ones that survive, and the ones that stay with this small neck, unfortunately, are the ones that don't reproduce. Usually they don't have enough energy to, because they haven't gotten the food, and so they die off. Where does life come from? So where does life come from? Does it come from non-life? Does it come from somewhere else? So we have a couple definitions here. Biogenesis is life comes only from other life. That is a definition of biogenesis, that you can't create life from nothing. You can't create life from the air. You can't create life from a rock, okay? Spontaneous generation, and these are pretty important definitions, a brief belief that non-living material could arise into living things. So that means like a rock could spontaneously generate a fly. So these are things that I'm going to show you an experiment that actually disproved spontaneous generation and how that came about. Okay, so in 17th century, most people believed that life could come from non-living things. So way back then, they believed maybe a fly could come from a rock. So one of the examples one of the scientists used is flies arise from rotting meat. So people thought that flies, if you leave meat out, eventually it would create flies. So that was the belief. So using scientific method, which talked about last week, Francisco Redi tried to prove that spontaneous generation did not occur. So he had a experiment that he did that showed that spontaneous generation, you could not get a living thing from a non-living thing. So Redi set an experiment to disprove the spontaneous generation. Okay, so this is what he did. His observation, remember our 5 steps, was when meat sits out, flies soon appear. They land on meat, maggots appear, and flies hatch out of meat. So that's what he saw if he just left the meat on the counter. So the problem is, do flies arise from rotting meat? So then he created his hypothesis, and his hypothesis was flies come from other flies. If I place rotting meat in contact with flies, then and only then can other flies be created. So he set up an experiment where he had rotting meat, and sometimes they were exposed to flies, some were exposed to flies, and some were not. Did they both get flies? So this is what he set up. So he had a jar, and he had some rotting meat, and he put a paper cover over it, okay, with a rubber band, and he set that on the counter. Then he had B here, which is something that was just open to the environment so things could go in and out. And then he had another one where he had gauze so the smell of the meat could come, and he had a rubber band around that. And he let them sit out, and he wanted to see which created flies. And so let's look at the variables. So the first thing, okay, is he had 3 jars, and let's look at. So the control was the jar with no cover. So nothing being done, just setting out on the counter just like everything else, and jar with cover and no contact with flies. So he put the paper cover so flies couldn't get to it. So if we just put, so his control was that if we just put meat out, will flies just appear? And so our independent variable is a cover or no cover. So should they have a cover or no cover? So that's what he changed, okay? And the dependent variable is measuring, does it have flies? Yes or no. So it's not really measuring number of flies, but do they have flies? And this is what he had found. Can you imagine? So what he saw, okay, what he saw, let me see. Okay. What he saw in the slide before here, before we go on, is he saw a jar with a paper cover with the rotting meat. Nothing happened. So no smell got out, nothing got out, no flies arrived. The one with the completely open, flies appeared. And the one with the gauze where they couldn't get to the meat, but they could smell it, actually created flies on the top. So they didn't actually come from the meat. They had to come from somewhere else. So his conclusion ended up being that flies have to come from other flies, that you have to have this open so that the flies can come here and lay their eggs and then create more flies. That flies don't just live on meat all the time and just show up. So his conclusion became life comes from life, so that spontaneous generation cannot occur. Okay. Now what I want you to do is I want you to take your notes and you're going to go back, and now is the time for reflection. So you've taken the notes, you're going to move on to step 2. You're going to go ahead and highlight anything that you need, underline any vocabulary, write any questions in the left-hand column there, and then go and finish your summary. So make sure you're also, as you're going through, after you've highlighted, then you're going to go through and make your connections, and any connections or prior knowledge that you had, you're going to write in there, and that will take you to your sentences or your summary, which you will write. This time you're going to write 4 to 6 sentences. Write specific facts that are discussed in these notes, and do not write, today I learned. There are no I's in scientific summaries, so do not use I, just state facts, and you can make connections. So try to do that. Take 10 minutes. Get this out. Once that is complete, that is what I want you, once it's highlighted, once you've made connections, processed all your notes, you've done your summary, that's when you're going to go ahead and attach it into the Google Classroom assignment and turn it into me, and I will stamp it and return it, and then you will put it into your notebook, okay? So here's an example of what I would write. All living things share 8 common characteristics. All living things reproduce, grow, develop, and organize and use energy. All living things maintain homeostasis, which is the process. Now notice, this I don't want to see on your notes. This is not you. This is not what you wrote. This is what I wrote. So if you do show this, I will return those notes and have you redo that summary. So please make sure that you are writing your own words. And if you are doing your notes with a partner, make sure this part you do not do together. Do this on your own. This is for you to process. Okay, and that is it. That is characteristics of life.